Paul,
Rob!
how's it going?
Good, you.
I'm excited about today's topic. I want to talk about accountability. I mean, we'll kind of anchor it on sales because I know that's your expertise. But I'm seeing that a lot of companies are just not holding a lot of their revenue teams accountable, right? And so there's a lot of marketers not being held accountable. There's a lot of service people not being held accountable. So what I'd like is that this, although we'll focus on sales, like I said, I think the lessons will be applicable elsewhere as well. And I did send you a set of questions just to help guide our discussion, but I'm really trying to get as concrete as possible and really answer and I really hope that people at the end of the show understand why accountability is so important, why we tend to not hold our reps or revenue teams accountable, and how can we do it, or at least what should we be holding them accountable for, and how can we do it? Those are kind of the four questions I'd like to answer.
I love it.
So let's jump right in, if you will, if you want. Like, why does it matter so much to keep our reps or our teams accountable?
Well, I like what you said when we started. It's not in sales, it's not just about the reps, right? It's the whole revenue team. And really, I think, and I agree with you, what we're going to talk about today is not even just about revenue. I think this can apply to anyone doing anything.
Yeah.
So when you're working in a team, and you have tasks to do and you're hoping for results, obviously you have to be accountable to what's going to get you there. And I deal a lot with this. A big part of when I train people or when I'm dealing with people or when I'm talking to CEOs is a lot about understanding how to get the team to do what you want them to do, right? So typically what people will say is like, okay, you have to do this now, I'm going to keep you accountable. But I think that's a little bit ass backwards, and I'll tell you why. And then I want your opinion on this.
Okay.
I think to hold someone accountable on anything, you have to get their buy-in, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm expecting some kind of action from you, regardless of whether it's sales or not sales or whether it's accounting, whatever, if I'm expecting an action and that action drives a result, I can either keep you accountable on the result or I can keep you accountable on the action. But regardless of whether I'm keeping you accountable on the action or the result, and we can talk about that another time, whether that's good or not, or later in the podcast, what you have to understand is you have to get that person, in my opinion, buy-in. You have to agree. The person who's being held accountable has to agree to being held accountable. And I know it sounds ridiculous. Well, of course, it's their job. They have to do this. But you have to understand why it drives them. And if they stop having that drive and they stop doing it, you need to understand why that person's not doing it. So it really, I think, in my opinion, it boils down to the individual's motivation and what drives them. And if what drives them is an action that will lead to a result, then you're on the same page. And keeping them accountable, I believe, becomes easier. There's a lot of other issues, but the first thing is, I think they have to be motivated. What's your thought on that?
Yeah. So I just want to make sure, like, so to me, like, that's it. Like you said at the top of your answer is that, accountability matters because if you're going to achieve any type of result, you have to make sure that you're doing what's needed to get there, right? And you're right. Maybe there's a bit more to unpack there, right? There's accountable to the activities and the accountable to the results. And maybe depending where you are in the organization, what your role are, some are maybe more relevant than others. But I think I really like what you said, because it's like what I see a lot happening, and obviously I get work with startups, and the reality of startups is the teams tend to be quite young and therefore inexperienced, and I find, like, I'm wondering if sometimes what we're trying to do is get a very junior person to do a lot of very senior things, right?
Well, that for sure, that's a problem.
Right. And so what's happening is that the leader, right, doesn't know what the salesperson actually needs to do. They just know they need the results, right? They're trying to hold them accountable to the results, but they don't know what needs to be. So then it's easy for a rep to then get distracted, right? Like We talked about some of the stuff before, like rewriting cold emails, instead of actually doing the activity, foregoing calls, stuff like that, just because they're not actually being held accountable to the activity, they're being held accountable to a result.
The results, yeah.
And it's not clear how to get there. So I really like what you said, that the person needs buy-in, right? Like the reason why I'm asking you so even if you don't have a lot of numbers, you can kind of like, guesstimate it, right? Again, I'm thinking about a smaller business that doesn't have years of data behind them. If I'm asking you to close, $1 million a year in business, like we know our average deal is roughly, 200,000. And we know that, and you can kind of work it backwards. Again, I'm assuming that you don't have a lot of historical data. If you have historical data, it's even easier. And so the person has to understand that the reason why I'm asking you to do, 3 discovery calls a week is because that's most probably what's going to get you to that $1 million in revenue a year.
And that's so true, Fab. And that's very important because, and here's the problem is sometimes the leader or the manager or the owner, we're talking sales. So we'll talk sales for a little second, but let's say that rep has a $3 million budget, right? Like you just said.
Yeah.
And they have to sell and they sell in increments of $20,000, right? Yeah. So they have to get, 15 deals, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
or whatever.
Yeah. I think it's 15 deals, not 150. So
forget the details, but yeah.
So if the representative understands the path to get there, then it's easier to keep them accountable. But also they have to have a buy-in. They have to want to do that. So what do I mean by that?
Right.
So if your boss says $3 million, yeah, you're like, okay, good. And you say, but you're going to have to do this to get there. And that person's like, well, I'm not really into doing all these calls and all this work. And but then you have to know that from the start. It has to be, what drives you, not drives you to get the $3 million, because that, everyone wants to make the $3 million sale, but what drives you, and are you motivated to do the actions necessary that will hopefully bring you to that result, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the real problem is that a lot of people will hold you accountable on the result, but really they should be holding you accountable on the actions, because what do you control? You control your actions.
Yeah.
You control habits. You control what you do. So let's assume for a second that we took care of the motivation. We know this employee is motivated. Well, then how do we keep them accountable? We say, we get the buy-in from the person to say, well, do you agree with me that you need to do these actions? And the person says, yes. Okay, how are we going to make sure you're doing these actions? Okay, well, It can be once a month. It can be once every quarter. It can be once a week. It can be once a day. We're going to talk about those actions, and we're going to make sure that you have everything you need to do those actions. It sounds stupid, but that's really, as dumb and as simple as that sounds, to me, that's what you do to hold someone accountable. The problem I see a lot, and I'm sure you see this too, is that the boss man or the boss lady doesn't know what it is that they need to do. They're not even sure. Hey, if you want that person to bring in if you want your marketing team to bring in 10,000 marketing leads this year, do you know what they need to do? No, I just know I want them to do that.
Right.
You can't keep people accountable to a result that you don't know the path to get there. You can't blame them for doing something that they themselves aren't sure about how to get there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And I think that's a huge problem. And obviously it's a little hard. Obviously the maturity of your company can make that relatively hard, right? Like, again, if it's the first marketing hire, it's obviously you don't.
Yeah, if they have no data, if they have no background, they don't know anything. You're right. It makes it hard to say.
But then where I see the challenge happening, and maybe we're going a bit off topic, so we'll rein it back in a minute. But that's where, like, do you really need a junior person, right? Like, do you need a junior person to do that job, right? Like, we often try to hire junior because we want to make sure that we're saving costs, but then we're asking these junior people, as junior rep, a first-time rep that's like straight out of school, to like, help you build your sales strategy at the end of the day, right? And they're like, I don't know, I don't know what I need to do,
so,
right? And so they do what they think.
You are going off topic there, but let's talk about that for a second. You're right that if you have a junior person that doesn't even know what they need to do, but they're willing to do anything. So then they'll go out and try things, and you might learn from that. And I think what you're saying too is that if you have that senior person, they might know a little bit more about what's going on. But regardless of whether it's junior or senior, if you're just looking at the results that you want to get, you're going to hit a wall eventually. Because I think we've talked about this in the past. Some people have different activity levels required to reach the same results. So a junior rep might need to do 5 times more calls on their junior network than that senior guy who can make 1 call and make the deal in a half an hour because he's got a whole bunch of, or she's got a whole bunch of contacts and she can close the deal. Now, what there too, are you keeping them accountable on that result? If you are, that's fine. But if you're keeping them accountable on actions, then then that junior person will probably do a lot better because they know I need to do many calls, I do this many emails, I need to do this many things. And then you can help them and say, well, why didn't you make those calls? Why didn't you do these things? But they have to be on board. And why is it hard? I think if we come back to the original point, why is it hard to keep people accountable? Is because people don't even know what they should be keeping people accountable on.
Right. And that's brilliant. Like, that's exactly kind of what my feeling too is. Like, I think there's a lot of different factors at play, right? Sometimes feeling accountable can feel like being the bad guy, right? And a lot of people don't like conflict and they don't like being the bad guy, and they're the first hire, so they want to make sure that the first hire is happy and all that stuff. But I believe I completely agree with what you say. I think at the end of the day, if we don't know what to hold them accountable on, because we're not salespeople, because we're not marketers, because we're not service people, we're afraid to be found out, right? We're afraid that if I'm going to hold you accountable to doing, well, you need to do 16 demos a day and or discovery calls a day or whatever it is, like, you're afraid, like, does that even make sense? Like, is this even reasonable? Like, is this possible? Like, was I doing that? You know what I mean? There's a lot of play there. So I think you're right. I think in smaller teams or younger companies, I think there's a lot of that at play. And I do realize that more senior companies, like not more senior, but more established companies,
more experienced,
have a bit more accountability. I mean, I don't work with as many of them, so you might disagree. But I think where we're looking at the smaller teams, where there's like a few reps, 1 or 2 marketing people, those have a really hard time because you're right. I think the leader just doesn't understand what needs to get done, and they're afraid that if they're putting too much emphasis on it, they'll be found out in a way. And that's where hiring more senior could potentially help you out.
It could potentially help, but if the owner still, or let's say the leader still doesn't know what needs to be done and they hire someone senior, the senior person might know, but it'll still be hard for the leader to keep them accountable. Because what it really boils down to, I believe, and let's go back to your young company that doesn't really know what they should be doing. Well, I'll regurgitate the words that you've said to me in the past. Marketing is not a precise science, right? So you've got to try different things. So as a new leader, you can't hold someone. First of all, the first mistake a lot of people make on revenue is they hold people accountable on results. That's usually because then you can have a really lazy, lucky person, or you can have a really hardworking, unlucky person. And who do you rather keep? And it becomes a real clusterfuck. So what you want to do, first thing to do is, if you're a young company, if you're starting out and you don't really know yourself, you're like, I don't really know what activities we should be doing. Try it out. I'm using fab words. Try different things out. See what happens. And start getting a path to the actions and the habits required to have success. Hey, when we did more of this, it did a lift over here. Okay, so do we want more of the? No, we don't. We actually want more of this. Okay, then we'll get a lift somewhere else. So you trial and error on the actions, the things that you control. Now, how do you keep people accountable? And that's by saying, well, Paul, you're our new rep. We've noticed that everyone who does this does well. Are you okay with doing this? Do you buy into doing this? And we're going to have a call every week, and we're going to talk about what you did. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay with that. Then there's no surprises. It's not like, oh, my boss doesn't trust me. He's asking me every week. No. You were hired under these pretenses.
Yeah.
You know what you'll be held accountable for. And if you get the results, we'll be really happy. And if you don't, we're going to tweak things to try to make it better. But you need to be doing these activities to get those results.
And I like what you just mentioned, because it's also that, how should I say, like, there's a few things that you said there that were interesting. Is one is like you're being honest, right? Assuming you're a small company again and you don't have that historical data, you're like, listen, right now we think you need to do 10 calls a day and like 6 emails and 10 LinkedIn messages a day. We think that's kind of based off of what we can kind of draw up on our napkin and kind of cycle through HubSpot and figure out what we've done. We think that should be good enough, but this might change every month. And if we increase it, it doesn't mean that you're worse, or if we increase it or whatever. So it just means that we're realizing that as the data comes in, we need to adapt what metrics we're going to be holding you accountable for.
Yeah.
And I think just adding that transparency and setting those expectations, right? Like that today I need to do 10 calls a day, but next month it might be 20 or it might be 5, right? We'll see. Okay, so we talked about why it's important. We talked about a few reasons why we might not be doing it. Really what I want to focus on the most, as much as possible, is how do we keep them accountable, right? Because I find a lot of people have the will, right? They understand that I need to keep my reps accountable. I need them to do certain activities, but they don't know where to start with it, right? They're looking at data. They're like, okay, they're doing activities, but like, how do you? But I'm going too far into it. How do you keep reps accountable? Like, how do you actually do it?
And forget just being reps. Okay, so I know we're talking about reps a lot, but let's talk about the revenue team. Okay, whoever it is that's accountable to a certain extent, who you want to tie a revenue to, right? So whoever is part of the revenue team, in the end, if they hit the revenue, you love them. If they don't, you want to fire them all, right? So the problem with accountability is, and I want to be really specific on this, and I think we talked about this in the past, and I've done a lot of work recently with this philosophy, is that you've got, and I think we've talked about it before, you've got actions, you've got methodology, and you've got results, right? So all you control are actions and methodology. You don't control the results. So the biggest problem with revenue teams is people are trying to keep them accountable to results, which you do not control. You control the actions. So how do you keep them accountable is you decide on the actions together. You have a consensus on what actions need to be done, because you can't force anyone to do any action. So they need to have that buy-in. And once you have that buy-in, you decide at what amount of time you will spend a week, a month, a year talking about what needs to be done. So then at the end of the week, it becomes, did you do those actions? And if the person says yes, but they have a really bad methodology, the results won't be there. If you're doing all your cold calls. So you need to keep them accountable on the actions. It's a lot easier, but you also have to look at the methodology, and you can almost keep someone accountable on methodology too, by making sure they're saying the right things or writing the right things or doing the right things. So that's where you keep them accountable. And you have an agreement to say, look, Fab, I'm working for you now. We're going to talk every Friday. You're going to ask me what I did this week, and I'm going to tell you where I have problems and where it's harder and easier. And that's what you're going to keep me accountable on, my actions and my methodology. And you're going to be there as my leader to help me out. Not just to bash on me, hey, you didn't do your calls. No, it's about, hey, you didn't do your 5 calls this week. What happened? This, that, this call went way too long, or this proposal too. How can I help you? Then it becomes, then the employee or the colleague becomes much more likely to want to be accountable, because that accountability actually serves a purpose. It's no longer, why didn't you win the race? It's, what did you do to try to win the race, and what can we do to help you try to win the race? I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think what I'm understanding is like, so you're right. Like the rep needs to accept. I think what I'd like to like push you a bit further on is like, I have a CRM, right? We've talked about CRMs in the past. And I'm assuming that's the tool that I'm going to use to keep them accountable, right? Like, because at the end of the day, I mean, we live in a data world. I mean, data is accessible now more than it's ever been. What should I be looking at, right, to be making sure that they're doing what I need them to? So we're assuming that we know we've set some sort of target on, let's say, number of calls. Let's keep it easy, number of calls. And they agree with it. They agree that it's going to change. And then now what do I do?
Well, now what you do is,
Whoops.
as the leader, you're seeing if that amount of activity generates the proper results with the methodology.
Right.
And then you're tweaking, saying, okay, do they need more training, right? Because they're
Right.
making all the calls. John is making all the calls, and he's making the same amount of calls as Paul, but he's closing everything, and Paul's having a really hard time. Well, what's the difference? Well, let's go listen to Paul's calls. So then you're going to say, well, look, you're going to need more training. So you're going to keep them accountable to say, well, look, your activity's there, but the results aren't there, and they are for John. And everything else being equal, you guys should be having the same results. So obviously, it has to be your methodology. It's what you're saying. It's what you're doing. It's how you present. So then let's work on that, right? That's one thing. The other thing is, if you're in the CRM and you're seeing calls, and let's say your deals are stagnating, and the one rep's deals are stagnating, you could say, well, look, the normal life cycle of a deal is 3 months, and all your deals seem to be going 6 months. What's going on, right? And then you can agree that right from the start, deals should take 3 months. If it takes longer than that, we're going to talk about it. I'm not surprising you with anything. That deal's been in there. I talked about it to you last month because it was in 4 months, and now it's at 5 months. What can we do? But there always has to be an element of the rep understanding or not understanding what's in their control to move forward. If you just bad with the results, say, hey, look, the results aren't there, or you got too many things, and this it needs to change. That's a directive approach, and it's an overarching analysis of the data, but you're not helping the person achieve that. You need to keep people accountable only on what it is that they control. That's what it boils down to. How do you do that in the CRM? You agree up front, whatever the parameters are: calls, emails, longevity of deals, repeat business, whatever it might be. And you agree up front, this is the data I'll be looking at in the CRM. I'm looking at it, and you're commenting on it, and I'll keep you accountable to the things that you said you'd do, that we agree that you need to do. And whatever that is, deal length, type of deal, calls, emails, whatever it might be, proposals.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I kind of wanted to get to, is like, now that we've agreed on what needs to get done, and I've showed you how we're going to keep track of it, and you understand that I'm not tracking it because I don't trust you. I'm tracking it to help you and to help. And if we're smaller as a company, help us understand what actually needs to get done, and to potentially identify where our pain points are. So for example, like I have somebody that I worked with, we looked at, average number of sales activities needed to create a deal in HubSpot. And we could see, like, you could clearly see the experienced reps need a lot less activities than junior reps. And so then you're like, okay, then the leader can go in and see like what's my senior reps doing that my junior rep, what can I do to ramp up these junior reps faster? But you could clearly see, right, that it's like, so I think that's where once a rep understands why the data exists, because I still see that a lot, right? Reps that are like a little iffy about getting tracked so much, right? There's a lot of pushback, a little less in the younger reps, but some of the more senior reps sometimes are a little like, well, I know how to close deals. Like, I don't need to. But there's value in this.
Human beings have a lot of ego, right? So if you're more senior, you kind of say, look, I don't need you to tell me what to do. They have more ego. Then again, that's because you didn't establish the rules. And if you establish the rules, no matter how senior the person is, say, look, you work with me, we work together, I'm going to do it this way. And if you're changing something, you have to get their buy-in. Because if you used to never follow that senior rep, and he always did his numbers, and all of a sudden you want to follow him, you better give him a damn good reason. You know what I mean? If you're changing the way things are done, and you expect to have the same results and to have a happy person, and say, well, look, Paul, you worked for us for 20 years. We never looked at one thing. We didn't even have a CRM. Now we're going to have a CRM. You got to write everything in there and expect the same results. Well, and what do I get more for this? Nothing. That's not very motivating.
That's not motivating.
Paul's been doing really well for the last 20 years, and you never asked him one thing, and you always patted him on the back, and now all of a sudden you're telling him he's going to have a CRM to fill in. He says, well, what's in it for me? And he's right. Now, if you say to Paul, hey, you're going to help the others, it's going to bring forward, we're going to give you a little percentage on what they sell. We want to understand how you do things, because we know that you want to retire, let's say in 10 years. And if you retire in 10 years and we don't know your secret sauce, it's not going to help us. This is rewarding for us. We're going to give you, I don't know, equity in the company, but there has to be something in it for them. Now Paul's motivated. Okay, I want to help these little juniors. I don't mind writing the things down, because I'm going to educate them on what it is that they need to know to help them move forward, right? So
Yeah.
there's a whole different now Paul's into it all of a sudden because he says, hey, this makes sense. But if you're not explaining it to Paul and he's like, F off, man, I'm not in this. You're not, it does nothing for me. I know how to sell and I'm not going to help you. And I had this exact experience with a client a few months ago who is a senior rep, and he was so frustrated, and we talked together and he had some conversations and he figured out that he can help and he wanted to continue, and that this is exactly how he can help the company is by saying, well, give me a cut of what it is that I'm going to be helping you with, rather than just asking me to now write everything down and be this great CRM user, because the guys from that other company, not HubSpot, they're great, but the guys from the other company came in and they want to force them to write a whole bunch of stuff down. So that's a problem in accountability there. It's like, I never agreed to that. You're just telling me to do stuff. You can't hold people. You could try to hold people accountable to things they don't agree upon, but they're not going to do it. You have young kids. If you're a little young kid, you're saying you got to brush your teeth every night for whatever, you got to give them something that's in it for them. If they hate brushing their teeth, I don't know, they either get an extra bedtime story or they get an extra 5 minutes watching their favorite show, but you're negotiating. So human beings are the same. If it's like all of a sudden I got to brush my teeth and there's nothing in it for me, I don't want to brush my teeth.
That makes sense. I really like that. I think I don't know if there's more to scratch there, but I think we should have a show on, and this would be for the companies that are a bit more established and bringing in a CRM for the first time. Because I mean, I've seen that, or when there's a change of process, right? Like a lot of companies have a CRM, but they don't really take care of it because they're like, I'm talking about the startups and young companies, because they're like, it's just a mess and everything's just doing whatever it takes to somebody once told me, like, just to live to die another day, right? Like, okay, we made it today, so that maybe tomorrow we can, try to survive again. But at some point, the company matures and they need their reps to start logging their activities properly and all that. So I think that change management that you just talked about was really, really interesting. I think we should have a special show on that.
I'd be happy to talk about that. I've seen that so often. Cool.
So let's wrap it up. I think we had some good stuff in here. But to me, my big takeaways are like, why do we need to keep them accountable? Because if we're not, from what I understand, if we're not keeping track of it, it's going to be really hard for you to grow as a rep, but for us to grow as a company.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I need you to do the activities so that we can scale. And if you take it on a personal basis, like as an individual, like if you want to make your commission to, buy a house in Cabo or whatever your personal motivation is, whether it's
that's a good motivation, Bob. I like it. Is that yours?
No, but maybe it should be. Like external or it's more intrinsic. Like I want to make good because I believe in the products I sell, make good and stuff like that. Like the only way for you to achieve that is by logging your activities, so we can make sure that we're on track. I really found interesting how he said, like, why we don't hold accountable. And I think there's a lot of fear of leaders holding accountable and to be found out that there may, that imposter syndrome where they feel they don't know and they're afraid to be discovered. So they kind of pull back and stuff happens. But at the end of the day, they're not holding accountable. And how to do it is just to, again, sit with the reps and explain this is what we're doing. Here's how we're going to track it in the CRM. And during our weekly calls, these are the reports we'll be looking at. And then using those reports to infer stuff, right? Like, hey, like how come that you in the last month are able to do, 300 sales activities, but, Paul can only do, 112. Like why? Okay, well, Paul had COVID. He was off for 2 weeks, right? So, but sometimes it's not just looking at the data, but it's using the data to infer information from it, right?
Yeah,
actionable information.
Yeah,
and working with the reps as opposed to just.
And we say reps, but we talked about accountability. I don't just see it as a rep. I see it as a whole rev team, right? So whoever, the marketing people, the ops, whoever it is that's working there, they're all together, right? Because they're all accountable to a certain extent to the results at the end. It's just you have to decide what you're going to keep them accountable on. If you don't know what to keep them accountable on, then try things out. But
But awesome, Paul.
You have to get the motivation in.
This was really interesting. I hope for everybody. I found it really interesting.
So did I.
And you there inadvertently did a good teaser for next week. Well, Alyssa's coming back on the show, and we're going to talk about balancing the needs on marketing. Obviously, immediate needs, getting leads immediately, and the long term. How do we balance the short term lead generation needs with the long term efforts it takes to have success in marketing? I think it'll be a super interesting show.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks,
Join
Paul.
us next week, everyone.
All right.
Bye.